Welcome everybody to this session of the EU Studies Working Group special session. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Professor Fritz Scharpf, who is Emeritus Professor and former Director of the Max-Planck Institute for the Study of Societies. Fritz Scharpf is one of the leading social scientists. I have difficulty sometimes thinking of him as a constitutional lawyer, as a political scientist, as a sociologist. I think he's one of the true social scientists in Europe, one of the leading social scientists also on Europe and beyond. And among the numerous distinctions and prizes that Fritz Scharpf has won and received over his very long career and distinguished career, I would like to mention the Johann Schutte Prize he won in 2000, which is a prize that is considered by many as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in political science. Fritz Scharpf is also a long-time friend of the EUI. He has served for many years on the Research Council of the Institute and in numerous committees. And it's a real pleasure to have you again here in Florence and debate with us on the future of Europe. I would also like to thank Adrienne Hitier and Stefano Bartolini to my left here, who will react to the talk that Fritz will be giving before we then want to open up to the floor and have a discussion with you all. I would also like to express a special thanks to Julian Schwarzkopf and to Rebecca Wolfberg from the EU Studies Working Group, who have been basically organizing this event. Also thanks to Valentina Bettin from the European Union Democracy Observatory, who helped with the logistics. I will be very brief with my introduction. I would simply like to recall a lecture not many of you have been at, a lecture that was given by Fritz Scharpf in 2008 on the 2nd of October, a UDU lecture as it is here in Florence, and the title of that event back then was Legitimacy in a Multi-Level Polity. And Fritz's argument back then was that legitimacy is some kind of functional prerequisite for voluntary compliance, a system where one can achieve losers' consent, which ultimately may lead to efficiency and efficient output. So legitimacy and efficiency are thus linked in Fritz's view, and they are in a relationship with each other and can even lead one to another. Now, today we're in 2012, October again. Fritz Scharpf is back, and this time the title of his talk will be The Economics of European Democratic Legitimacy. In 2008, Fritz gave his talk a mere 17 days after the Lehman Brothers had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Today, Europe is in the midst of the biggest economic, political, and institutional, I would say, crisis of the post-World War II era. And though I cannot really anticipate what Fritz will offer us today, but judging from the title of his speech, the focus compared to 2008 remains on legitimacy, but with the multi-level polity being somehow replaced by economics. Still, the question of the polity cannot be ignored. Today, the crisis, as so many crises in the past, leads to positions that are taken as two antipodes of European integration. On the one hand, you have federalists that are sensing an opportunity for their dream to come true, some kind of federal state with its own taxing powers and majority-based procedures through which one can actually overcome the unanimity principle for constitutional change. And on the other hand, you have those who hear the union's swan song in the distance. For them, abandoning the euro, returning to national monetary policy, and a general cutback on European competencies is the only way out of the crisis. And in the middle, you have those trying to reform the unreformable maybe, those fighting against the downgrading of entire countries by rating agencies, and opening one legally doubtful, by the way, umbrella after the other in order to stay as dry as possible from the economic thunderstorm Europe is undergoing right now. So whatever solution will be found, the question, I think, of legitimacy will remain central, in particular if it is linked or standing in a relationship, as Fritz has proposed for many years, with efficiency. So that's what I wanted to say to introduce your talk, and I would like to give you now the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and also thanks to Rebecca and Maureen for getting me here. I very much enjoy being back here, and I have to say perhaps a sentence about the title. My position is that we cannot understand the challenges of that European legitimacy has to meet if we do not understand the nature of the economic challenges that the Euro area and the European Union is facing. To begin with, there is a very surprising convergence of discourses at the moment in which Habermas and the President of the European Parliament, the President of the Commission, and Merkel or Schäuble, and others all seem to be in agreement that we have to move forward toward political union and toward political legitimacy, democratic legitimacy, in order to solve, in order to deal effectively with the Euro crisis. And in my view, there is a very strong subtext to that discourse, which cynically one might interpret as saying, let's democratize European institutions so that we can legitimately impose the policies we consider necessary anyway. And in order to deal with this kind of position, I wish to emphasize that, in my view, legitimacy must be seen as a relational concept, a concept that relates the severity of the sacrifices that have to be imposed with the capacity to legitimate of different types of legitimating arguments, structures, and processes. The need for legitimacy increases with the severity, and the capacity for legitimation depends on the strength of the justifying arguments. And as I've pointed out elsewhere, democratic legitimacy has two dimensions: output-oriented arguments, buon governo, think of the Lorenzetti fresco in Siena, and input-oriented arguments, responsive government, think of much of the work of Peter Mayer at this institute. And before the Euro crisis, legitimacy of the European Union was not a highly salient political issue. It was an academic issue, but in the political realm, output legitimacy of the European Union was not seriously challenged, and while input legitimacy was considered to be weak, no European-wide political parties and political debates, Simon Hicks arguments, or take Miguel Maduro's statement that self-government needs a government, and Europe didn't have a government, and it did not have political electoral accountability, so input legitimacy was weak. But at the same time, the policy output of the European Union was relatively low in political salience. Low-level government, one could say, and in any case, there was what I call legitimacy intermediation. That is, since the member states had and have to implement all European policies, it was they and their own political legitimacy that protected European policy making from legitimacy challenges. If governments were held accountable for policies chosen at the European level, it was national governments that were held accountable. Now, that in principle ended with the commitment to the monetary union. This screen you can't read probably. It's a recent report by J.P. Morgan that points out that the membership of the European Monetary Union is the least likely group of countries among a whole range of potential groups to be suitable for a monetary union, because its internal diversity, heterogeneity, is greater than that of all alternative groupings. And that went on for about a decade without obvious problems, even though difficulties were building up. But then the Lehman Brothers failure that you have just referred to brought it all out into the open. What did the monetary union do? It disabled national macroeconomic management. It took away monetary policy, it took away exchange rate policy, and it severely limited fiscal policy at the national level. At the same time, it also removed the balance of payments constraint on national economies, while before the monetary union, if you were selling less than you bought internationally, you either had to get credit or you had to provide gold or hard currencies to pay for the outflows. That was taken away by the monetary union. And at the same time, the European level macroeconomic policy of the European Central Bank had to be uniform, and it had to have uniform interest rates. Its exchange rate policy, if there was any, would have the same effect in all member states. Since member state economies continue to be extremely different, heterogeneous, the one-size-fits-all did in fact not fit those countries with an above-average economic dynamics, nor those countries with a below-average economic dynamics. So as a consequence, the beginning of the monetary union meant a deep recession in Germany and a credit-financed boom in what we now call the gypsy countries, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and perhaps Italy. The consequence of that were divergent unit labor costs, divergent current account balances, and with the Lehman collapse, a worldwide credit crunch had its main impact on countries that were over-indebted internationally. So here I just ran through a few graphs, the divergent unit labor costs, Germany versus the gypsy countries, divergent current account balances, Germany moving from deficits into heavy surpluses, and the gypsy countries moving into deficits. With the Lehman crisis, all countries that were affected had to save their own banks. Governments had to increase their public sector indebtedness in order to deal with the international financial crisis of 2008. As you see from this graph, there were members of the gypsy group, like Ireland and Spain, whose government indebtedness was extremely low, much lower than the Maastricht limit and much lower than the German performance as far as government indebtedness was concerned. Portugal was about like Germany, and Italy and Greece were higher, but did not increase up to the Lehman crisis. And then, of course, there came the big increase. So the interpretation that has been abroad in Europe in the last few years, that it was reckless borrowing by gypsy governments that caused the euro crisis, is simply wrong. It wasn't government indebtedness up to the Lehman crisis, and the problem only began after the Lehman crisis. But capital markets that had in the past, in the run-up to the monetary union, produced rapidly converging interest rates on government debt, so that by 2000, the interest on government debt was practically identical in Germany and in the gypsy countries. And then it remained at that level of very low interest rates for government debts until the Lehman crisis. But when in the Lehman crisis it became obvious that the current account deficits impaired the ability to pay of countries that had very high current account deficits, and that if these countries, if the economies were over-indebted, that would also throw in doubt the capacity of governments to repay their public sector debt. Then suddenly interest rates on government debt diverged again, and that meant we were moving into the euro crisis, because with very high thresholds of interest rates in gypsy countries, the ability to pay of Greece and then of other countries what became indeed doubtful. And at that point, the members of the monetary union responded. They saw the threat of state insolvency in Greece and other countries as a threat to the euro and to the monetary union, and some, like Merkel said, as a threat to European integration and the European Union. And so they agreed to create rescue funds financed from national budgets that were never big enough and never certain enough to really prevent current speculation on national debt. And at the same time, because these rescue funds were financed from national budgets of the creditor countries, it seemed approach to the countries that received rescue credits. And these austerity requirements, which were extremely tough, had the effect of deepening the economic and social crisis and requiring structural reforms, to which I will turn later. So what I'm trying to show here is that the period after the beginning of the crisis, the rescue operations and the conditionalities attached to rescue credits had the effect of deepening the economic and social crisis. GDP was falling and mass unemployment was rising fantastically in some countries, and it is still rising in a number of countries. The overall macroeconomic effect of all this is captured in this graph, which shows that as a consequence of the macroeconomic divergence that was caused by the monetary union and that was triggered by the Lehman bankruptcy, had the effect of driving apart the real effective exchange rates. The nominal exchange rates, of course, are fixed in the monetary union, but if unit labor costs diverge as they do, and if economic developments diverge, that has an effect on the real effective exchange rate, and the overall effect is that as a consequence of this divergence, German exports are at this time subsidized by an amount of nearly 20% in inter-Eurozone trade, while the exports of Ireland, Spain, and other gypsy countries are penalized by a very high excessively high real exchange rates. So what would be the economic requirements of a post-crisis regime that responds to the developments that I have just outlined? There are, in my view, three very different Euro crisis, types of Euro crisis that have to be dealt with. The one that's in the foreground of all Euro rescue activities at the moment is the state credit crisis in gypsy countries, the trend of interest rates that governments have to pay, which shoots up whenever there is additional uncertainty. Then it comes down a bit again if rescue operations are announced, and then it moves up again. So the state credit crisis is what keeps the Euro rescue operations going at the moment. But in addition to this state credit crisis, there is this fundamental economic and social crisis in the gypsy countries that are affected, and these economic and social crises, as I've argued, have been actually deepened by the conditionalities attached to operations dealing with the first aspect of the Euro crisis, the state credit crisis. And there is finally the divergence of real exchange rates, or should one say the divergence of international competitiveness within the Eurozone that needs to be corrected if the economies of the gypsy countries are supposed to get back on a growth path that will overcome their economic crisis. And the policies that would be required by the three types of euro crisis are very different in character too. The state credit crisis could be overcome and should be overcome by relaxing the taboo on monetary state financing, by allowing the European Central Bank to buy government bonds of the crisis countries directly rather than in the secondary markets. Buying government bonds in the secondary markets has the perverse effect that the European Central Bank is issuing extremely cheap money to the banks in the hope that these banks will then be willing to buy government bonds at much higher rates. Instead, it would be much preferable if the ECB could finance state bonds directly. But that's a taboo that nobody so far, not even the ECB itself, is willing to touch. Secondly, the economic and social crisis would require, in an ideal world, a massive Keynesian reflation that, since it cannot be financed locally, would require massive European transfers of funds, not just credits to deal with the state credit crisis, but substantial transfers to finance a fiscal reflation of these economies. But unfortunately, there is the third, the effective exchange rate or competition crisis, which would require the forced convergence of effective exchange rates. That is, the German effective exchange rate would have to be pushed upward, and the gypsy exchange rates would have to be pushed downwards. And as I'll show, this is going to be the toughest of these requirements to be addressed. The basic problem then with which we are faced is macroeconomic imbalances that have been generated by the EU. One size fits none. The cause are massive disequilibria in national economies. These internal disequilibria create external imbalances signified by current account surpluses and deficits, by capital exports and imports, and by rising and falling international competitiveness. The problem is that we do not have a European macroeconomic policy that could deal with these external imbalances. We do not have, and we probably cannot have, differentiated monetary policies issued by the European Central Bank, with higher interest rates for Germany and lower interest rates for Spain, controlled by ECB policy. And we do not have a European budget that would allow for counter-cyclical European financed fiscal policies to deal with the crisis. And the basic problem remains that the EU, the monetary union, has disabled national macro responses. Deficit countries cannot use monetary restraint to reduce domestic demand and to reduce imports, and they cannot use monetary nominal devaluation to reduce imports and to increase exports. And surplus countries like Germany cannot use monetary or fiscal reflation to increase domestic demand and to increase imports, and they cannot use nominal revaluation to increase imports and reduce exports. So what remains which policy options do remain to deal with the current crisis. The only options that we have, we do not have European macroeconomic responses. We do not have national macroeconomic responses. So what is left is national incomes policy and national supply side policies that deal with these imbalances. That is, states with external deficits should use incomes policy to reduce social incomes in order to reduce imports, and they should try to reduce wage incomes, nominal wages, to increase exports and profits and to reduce imports. And surplus states like Germany should increase social incomes to increase imports. The problem is that the Stability Pact doesn't allow them to go into deficit to do that. And they should increase wages to reduce exports and profits and to increase imports. And nobody knows how governments can do that. And if it were possible to specify these national adjustment responses, it would be obvious that they are not what economists would call incentive compatible. First of all, their effectiveness and political feasibility remains doubtful. But the surplus states, like Germany, would lose exports, they would lose jobs, and their firms would lose profits. And there is no economic pressure on them to do that. The economics of the situation do not force them to make these politically and economically painful adjustments. And the deficit states, likewise, if they were following these recommendations, they would have to deepen their own social crisis. And again, they are not under an economic pressure to adjust. There is no, even now, there is no balance of payments constraint. They can continue to run a current account deficits, and while these are no longer financed by private banks crediting banks in the gypsy countries, they are now financed through the European Monetary Union by what's called the Target 2 balances, where the deficits are run up on the balance sheet of the Monetary Union and the surpluses are run up on the balance sheet of the Monetary Union. And any deficit of exports or surplus of imports still gets refinanced by capital transfers from the surplus countries to the deficit countries by way of the monetary union's target 2 balances. As a consequence, because there is a lack of economic pressures, economic constraints, the national adjustments that would be required will not come forward voluntarily. So the consequence is there is a need for European compulsion if there should be ways of dealing effectively with these imbalances that are being caused by the monetary union. Defending the monetary union requires compulsory interventions from the European level. And to make things worse, these interventions have to be discretionary. They cannot be rule-based. The diversity of the member state economies and the contingency of economic conditions makes it impossible to create a rule-based economic governance system. And these interventions cannot be at the macro level affecting aggregate demand in the various states without interfering with the adjustment of relative prices below these macroeconomic aggregates. They have to target specific policies rather than economic aggregates. They have to deal with labor law changes, industrial relations changes, effects on reservation wages, that is unemployment insurance. They have to specify particular taxes to be raised or lowered and particular social regulations to be increased or mainly decreased. And these interventions in all countries have to be highly intrusive, and they will be highly politically salient. And compliance must be monitored and enforced. Local monitoring and direction of the type that the Troika is practicing will be necessary, and there have to be massive sanctions that cannot be subject to political bargaining in order to deal with their impact. And what is worse, exactly this type of regime has already been decided upon and put in place by the adoption of the six-pack regulations of the Council and the European Parliament that did not have to be transposed into national law by national parliaments, as would have been true with the directives. They are directly effective, and they have exactly the characteristics that I have described here, and in particular the regulations on macroeconomic imbalances provide for recommendations by the Commission that can recommend the use of any and each instrument of national policy, social policy, education policy, tax policy, labor market policy. And if these recommendations are not complied with by the target state, there will be massive sanctions. And these sanctions, the recommendations will be defined by the Commission, and the sanctions will be imposed by the Commission, and the Council could only avert them by a reverse qualified majority vote. That is, a very small number of country votes will maintain these impositions by the Commission. So what we have is a challenge to the legitimacy. No, what we have is a challenge to legitimacy that is defined by having to legitimate a European authoritarian regime. Its output legitimacy remains highly uncertain. There is no input legitimacy at the national levels. The adjustments are not incentive compatible. They are unlikely to be chosen by competitive democracies. They have to be imposed, and if not complied with, enforced. So there's no national input legitimacy. And at present, there's also no European input legitimacy. The Commission, which runs the show, is not itself supported by democratic legitimacy. The Council that is formally backing the decisions proposed by the Commission its members are legitimated by votes in their national constituency. But the German electorate cannot authorize Merkel or Schäuble to impose constraints and sanctions on Greece. And the Greek electorate is, of course, not present at the European table because the target countries have no vote in the decisions of the Council. So these intergovernmental decisions in the Council cannot claim democratic input legitimacy because they're based on national electorates and they're imposing decisions on countries other than those who have supported. Yeah. So if we should think of how such an authoritarian regime at the European level could be legitimated, we have to take those who propose the solution to the euro crisis should lie in moving forward to more Europe, to create a political union to save the euro. We have to ask them what could be the structure of legitimacy of such a political union that is able to save the euro on the terms that I have described. And the proposed legitimating architecture is, of course, we should have European Parliament elections in which the European parties run candidates for the position of Commission President, and the hope is that these elections would then politicize European policy choices, that European policy choices would be presented in these European Parliament elections, and then the choices would have political support. The President would be supported by a parliamentary majority coalition, and the European Parliament will then be able to authorize these euro rescue measures, and the European Parliament coalition itself would then be accountable to the European electorate. The problem is that the euro rescue measures cannot be rule-based. They cannot be defined by legislation ex ante. They must be discretionary and ad hoc. They have to be highly intrusive and highly politically salient, and they cannot respect, as the six-pack regulations do not respect, the existing distribution of competencies between the European Union and its member states. They have to intrude on the full range of national competencies. So the issue is, can we legitimate a discretionary central state, can we legitimate discretionary central state interventions that potentially can reach all member state policy choices? The philosophy that would support that is of a Jacobin or Leninist variety of democratic centralism. It's unheard of in any existing democratic federal state. No existing democratic federal state would be able to exercise the powers that would be necessary here, or that are already in place under the six-pack regulations. And of course, the European Union and the monetary union are still very far from being a democratic federal state. Could the European Parliament majority authorize such interventions legitimately? As I try to point out, the diversity among the target countries, the target economies, is so enormous. Greece is not Ireland, and Estonia is not Slovenia, and France is not Germany, and each of them would require different packages of measures to cope with the problem. And each case would have to be settled on its own merits. So the ideologies of European party families would not really resolve any of these issues. And if they should be left to majoritarian determination in the European Parliament, the hope that's voiced by practically everybody who is coming forward with such proposals, that the European Parliament would sort itself into a conventional left-right coalition opposition patterns. The hope that the traditional left-right perspectives, discourses would be dominant seems quite unrealistic as compared to the expectation that you would have very severe North-South conflicts in the European Parliament, and behind these North-South conflicts, even more vicious East-West conflicts, because after all, Ireland is the richest country in the European Union, apart from Luxembourg and a few exceptions, and there's Romania and Bulgaria and others that are extremely weak. And if we should vote on European transfers in the European Parliament, it's by no means clear that it will be the victims of the euro crisis that have the most salient and the most persuasive claims on European rescue. So what is the conclusion? My conclusion is that if the euro is maintained, there are no good solutions available. The best that we can hope for is muddling through with some improvements. We could hope that the European Central Bank will somehow, together with the European, with the EMS, manage to contain the state credit crisis. We can then hope that the supply side reforms and the austerity requirements will be toned down a bit, so that the gypsy countries get some more breathing space. We can also hope that some of the national funds that are no longer needed for the stability funds might be made available as permanent transfers to the gypsy countries. But even if that happens, the most likely economic outcome is long-term stagnation in the southern and western economies, in the peripheral economies, and the most likely fate is that of East Germany, which after 20 years of massive West German subsidies is still at a level of 60% of GDP per capita, and is falling behind rather than moving ahead. Or think of the Mezzogiorno after 6 decades of north-south subsidies in Italy. So the best we can probably hope for is policies by stealth and subterfuge, to cite Adrienne, trying to cope with the situation, and a situation in which politicization of any kind could only be totally disruptive. So my view is that the present euro crisis simply cannot serve as a vehicle for building the political union and democratizing Europe. Democratizing Europe has to build on common interest rather than divided interests. It has to look at European policies that serve the common interest rather than constraints on national policies. And it has to use European resources rather than requiring the commitment of national resources. And all that I mean, there are proposals by Miguel Maduro, for instance, that are very plausible and reasonable, but in my view, these are longer-term perspectives that cannot be instrumentalized for dealing with the short-term problems of the euro crisis. Thank you.
Adrienne, you can mention on the last slide. I would like you to react right away.
Yes, I'm happy to react in kind of general terms where I fully agree with Fritz, and then just ask a few more specific questions after the general kind of statement. I think your conclusion, in a way, really kind of pinpointed down exactly what the problem actually is of the European Union faced with a financial crisis and the subsequent fiscal crisis of sovereign states, that it actually was with its incremental orientation of policy change, it's not kind of made to react to a crisis. And so what it tends to do, or the options of the policy possibilities were when it was faced with this financial and fiscal crisis, you listed them: austerity, debt restructuring, break up of monetary union, quantum leap in European integration, which you said could not happen. ECB steps in as a kind of a fallback position faced with the lack of possibility of member states to agree to come to a quantum leap of European integration. And so what we got, in a way, is this linking of austerity policy, debt restructuring, which were unavoidable in a way. The quantum leap was not possible in the short run, and I would agree with you, need at least 10 years to be brought about, if at all, and breaking up would be enormously costly, and there's no option. So what happened, what we did see, and you mentioned in your presentation, is austerity with all its problems for the gypsy states, debt restructuring, plus interventions of the ECB, which we found as a package of measures in order to do, in a way, continue on this incremental path, to buy more time, to buy more bonds so that the periphery states can buy more bonds, that the prices of their bonds go up, gives them time to adjust economically. Well, that sense that would mean, hence, then a kind of a financing which is generous enough for that readjustment can take place in the periphery over maybe 5 to 10 years, and the recapitalization of their banks, and inflation in the credit countries. But you said, and what I found really interesting, you said, so what are the economic incentives for both sides to do that? There are really no economic incentives to engage in that, and therefore, as you said, therefore you need compulsory measures from the European Union, from the Commission, to step in and say, you member states do this in particular in a discretionary way because the economic situations are so different, because, as you rightly said, monetary union has increased macroeconomic leverages, and not what we expected to happen. So that's in a way what we have gotten so far. And it shows that the European Union is, as it has been from the very beginning in a way, what has been called nor fish nor farm, neither fish nor farm. But it's a 50-50 kind of polity, not a federation, but it's not just a currency union either. And I think what is the most difficult thing, in a way, is to, when we know that it's unreal and unrealistic to expect a political union at this point, And I think you have very convincingly shown why this is impossible at this point. So we have, in a way, a complete union, or the least of a political union which one could need. But at the same time, in a way, we have to be careful that these partial transfers which are being conducted, particularly in the peripheral states, economies, are not linked to political disruptions, which we already kind of see taking shape, which may become very, very problematic for further development. In a way, sadly to say, I think a federation would be necessary. At the same time, it is impossible. It's impossible to go for it at the present moment with this divergence, because I think national electorates just wouldn't be willing to go for it. Not in the north, but not in the south either, not in the periphery either. Therefore, we are left with the situation in a way of crisis as an employment condition with incremental measures, which in a way, as you have seen, you read the newspapers every day, what is being happening, Eurozonization of the banking system, which is in the process of being legislated, tolerable terms for funding adjustment for the peripheral economies, and as I completely agree with you, more flexibility for national fiscal targets, more time for all these states. It's totally unrealistic to think that this can happen next year, or 2 years from now, or 3 years from now. Totally unrealistic. At the same time, we have this kind of hidden or covert process of integration where tax policies, step by step, will become more centralized. More and more things are taken over by European regulatory networks, which do amount to a certain centralization of power. And as you pointed out correctly, I think, is that if we look very closely, and that is something which has actually happened with the support of the European Parliament, which was actually even stricter in adopting the six-pack regulation by saying there should be automatisms which are introduced. This kind of control behavior of what you call the authoritarian regime has been fully supported by the Council and the Parliament, and is, as we speak, is being applied. It's applied in a very lenient way so far, which is interesting to see. It hasn't been, or at least to my knowledge, there haven't been any concrete measures yet where it would be said, now this particular measure is not acceptable, or particular member state will, because it will be too costly in view of your budget deficit. So how that plays out, we don't know exactly. So we have the economic surveillance, entire pack regulations and one directive, plus 2 pack, and steps and interim instruments which go in the direction of a fiscal union, which you see now the Van Rompuy proposal, for instance, which is coming out in the last days, which is proposing fiscal capacity, and among other things, this employment fund, European Employment Fund, where I could imagine that this would be a measure which would find support among member states and member governments of all types, in view of political pressure also in the peripheral states, that the way such incremental or partial measures will be taken to somehow keep the system afloat and see us through the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you very much, everyone. Then I would like to carry on a few words because it's very difficult for me to comment on Fritz's paper for the very elementary reason that I basically agree on every single word he has said. And it has expressed in a marvelous way concern that I myself have had since long. Not, of course, in relation to the specific crisis that we know only. Really devastating. Perhaps Fritz hasn't mentioned a few other things that are particularly important in the perception of the crisis country, gypsy country, soft countries. I mean, it is not only an imbalance between south and north, there is an imbalance also between in and out. If you look at those countries that are outside the euro, they're doing much better than the countries in the south inside the euro. It is a bit of a mystery, if you want, to understand why Britain, for instance, was a huge deficit and has no hope whatsoever to get to the 3% in the next few years, finances public debt at 1%, while the other countries have to pay 5% to get the same. Poland is doing fantastically well, and of course is considered, well, we want to join the euro, but let's see. There is also this peculiar other imbalance between those in, those out. Although we know that exit is not an easy, absolutely an easy option. This problem comes from very far, in my opinion. I would have that. It is a long time that in the EU we have a constant, persistent, dramatic imbalance between the political production of the new sector and the capacity to sustain this production in legitimacy terms. This is an imbalance that has occurred very often in the history of political entities, and which was typically, I mean, that period of increasing treaty reform that led from the late 80s to the late 90s was, in my opinion, catastrophic when you look at the system in its indeed capacity to sustain the policies it was actually adopting with such a terrible speed. I have another comment, which of course is not part of Fritz. When I consider the situation, I consider that some countries should seriously consider option B, that is exit, and should be considered more seriously than they actually do. It seems to be a sort of common consensus that the euro has to survive. I know two things. The Italian government, let me mention only my country, is absolutely, it cannot conceive. At the moment we are governed by a government which I have high opinion of, but cannot conceive of an option B. But the central bank in Rome is studying it. I mean, of course, you all know that the central bank was, since the beginning, very doubtful about the euro, and probably they were right, we can say today, in Italy. I don't know if the other countries are of that sort. But the exit option is not discussed except in circles of experts, which I'm trying to understand. Let me point to another aspect that perhaps that you could have mentioned of this paradox. Some of the countries that are experiencing since 5 years are declining their GDP, are also experiencing, to the same years, a quite high level of inflation, which is part of this. Now, this is against economic theory. The economists have some difficulty to explain how we can have a 5 year of recession and 4% of inflation, which seems to be the real inflation. 4% in some of these countries. Yeah, I mean, but how that happens is probably part of the picture that Fritz described. So these are, as you can see, these are very scattered notes, but they are, I think, reinforcing. The politicization. I mean, there has been one moment in my life in which I decided to go public with my opinion was against this idea, because I found completely unsound, and to be unsound wouldn't be a problem. I thought since the beginning that it was absolutely counterproductive. So it would have created more problems rather than solving anyone. Some measures do not solve the problem, okay, some exacerbate them, and that was certainly one of them. And it was, I think, articulated in a sort of way that the French would call chevalier, somehow an easy way to find solution in the historical example of the nation state, and particularly of some of the nation states, because this majoritarian obsession has never been part of certain culture of the continent. I don't want to repeat all this, but I think that what Fritz articulated very well is one simple or two simple basic law of politics. There is no majoritarian functional logic that can legitimate territorial issues. Full stop. You cannot invent, nobody has invented that institution to solve conflict that originate in interterritorial problems, whether they are ethnical or economic, that can be solved by a majoritarian mechanism. These are no postulates. There's no way you can be as creative as you want in inventing solution, electing this, electing that, but you will not be able to solve this problem. Which, of course, brings us back to the first predicament of politics. There is no way to have a rule for decision unless you have predefined in a contractual way the entity and the power of that entity. You can't get both at the same time, and it cannot be. And incidentally, let me add another question, which is perhaps even more pessimistic, but it is behind no, it's more pessimistic than what Fritz said. Because Fritz said, you could even think about European democracy if you were doing so in a consensual way, in a period in which resources are available at European level without redistribution territorial. So in certain conditions you might think of doing some step forward. I'm even skeptical of that. Because if you look to the history of mankind, we have seen, and of course history of mankind is not finished, therefore I could be démenti, as you say, proven wrong tomorrow. We have seen all sorts of authoritarian, totalitarian entities over time democratizing. We have seen this. I've never seen an inherent exit structure like the market being democratized. That is, if you have a power, you can democratize it. If you have an exit structure, it is an exit structure. You will not create a movement to complain about the quality of the car you have bought. You'll buy another one. Very unlikely to have political structuring in this, and the EU remains an inherent exit structure, which is demonstrated every 2 minutes by continuously new emerging, advanced, now the last one is the Tobin tax proposal. What this could produce. But, and finally, a word about the authoritarian regime. Yes, I can see there, Fritz, the logic that leads you, in a sense, almost, if you want, Hobbesian way. If you want that, then you have to have that. And I wouldn't have any problem with the authoritarian regime of the modern time, respecting human rights and property rights, but not being legitimate democratically. I mean, I think Fritz meant that, of course, authoritarian. I wouldn't have any problem, as I have a relatively poor opinion of what we call democracy, or at least less enthusiastic than most people would have. But the real problem is that you have an authoritarian, a multi-level authoritarian regime. That is, you cannot have an authoritarian regime in Brussels and democracy at the national level. What would happen, what happens since always in the United States, the local politician going against Washington, the local politician will simply go against Brussels. Because you see, I think, and then I conclude, the key problem in Europe, it's a, if you want, it's a node problem. Now I need a bit of a drawing, but in every territorial consolidation, you have on one side the central builders, let's call the Brussels authoritarian functionary elites there. Then you have the local rulers, and these are the national governments. And then you have the ordinary citizens. An authoritarian solution requires a Jacobi solution, requires a strong link between the central builders and the ordinary people against the local rulers. And we don't have that. We have all agreed that we don't have that. So in a sense, otherwise the local rulers ally with the ordinary citizens against the central builders, which is very likely what is going to happen if we push the authoritarian solution. So again, I do not disagree with that. I have only a few side remarks. We have got in a trap. And indeed, the only hope is that a bit of this, a bit of that the Italians would implement their reforms, and the Portuguese would do the same, and the German would be a bit more flexible, perhaps willing to increase a bit their internal demands, and so on and so forth. But with no possibility to design a clear program or plan, with no possibility. In this context, I'm very worried also, honestly, by this idea that many people indeed express that the crisis is going to produce more Europe. That's one of those statements that, nobody knows whether they have any real sense. I mean, in the situation that Fritz so powerfully described to us. But there are these apprentice witches that at every moment they find an occasion to jump into more Europe. Sorry, it was too long. Thank you very much.
As an issue, you have to have a clear, communicable solution that's simple enough to be communicated. And the kind of solutions that the Euro crisis requires, let's do a little bit of this in France and a little bit of that in Germany and still something else in Ireland and so on, is nothing that you could politicize at a European level. You could not build a European discourse around such types of muddling through solutions. And so as soon as you ask the electorate to vote on European Euro rescue policies, my expectation is they will vote like the voters in American congressional elections on their local interest. And of course, the voters in Germany might be persuaded to vote for a solidaristic Europe. The voters in Finland or in Slovakia are much less likely to buy that. And the voters in Estonia or Latvia that have as high unemployment rates as does Spain or Greece, but no state credit problem because of the rigorous policies which they adopted, they will surely not see any reason why they should be solidaristic with countries that have not imposed such sacrifices on themselves. And that's also my response to the Van Rompuy proposal that the European Employment Fund should be instrumentalized. Once you do that, the question comes up, but why for Spain, why for Portugal, and not for any number of countries that have as severe or even more severe employment problems, and then the fund will not go anywhere. So with everything else, I'm in full agreement with everything both of you have said, except one point. Stefano, I think you're throwing out, well, maybe not the baby with the bathwater, but options that in the past have been relevant when you say you cannot democratize the market. As long as we had national economic boundaries, Swedish democracy could deal with the market in very Swedish ways that were very different from what the Germans did or what the Brits did. And what the Germans were doing was again different from what the French were doing. And in that sense, we have been able to democratize the market in some sense in the decades after the Second World War. And it's only when we have maximized capital mobility and have torn down all national economic boundaries that the national capacity to democratize the market has eroded and practically disappeared in many regards. And the hope that it might be possible at the European level to re-establish a capacity for democratizing the market is what's driving positions like that of Habermas and many of the, quote, good Europeans on the political left. What they do not see is, and do not acknowledge, is that the European integration has been the most powerful and most effective force in destroying economic boundaries. And it's practically impossible at the European level to re-establish these boundaries in an effective way. But still, that's the logic of the present debate. We can no longer do it at the, we have destroyed the preconditions for doing it at the national level. Can we recreate the conditions at the European level? That's what the debate ought to be about. And I don't think it's as foreclosed that the outcome will be as pessimistic as you say.
I think the same.
But not in the level, but not in the euro crisis.
It will be even more difficult because the EU is more an inherent extraction than the nation states ever was.
Yeah.
May I just jump in, come back to one of the questions that was, in a sense, raised by Stefan on the very first one, was that basically, which you didn't really answer, is that this joint euro saving trap that you sketch out very well only exists in a sense if the euro saving strategy is the only option. Is it really, would be my question, following up on Stefano, is a redesigning of the current eurozone by redesigning it by coming up with a smaller eurozone, for example, wouldn't that be an option to overcome some of the economic problems we have? Partial exits, complete exits, accompanied by Marshall-type plans for those who do exit, etc. Is that?
I've long argued that a return to the European monetary system that we had from 79 to 99 would be the solution. And it could be improved in many ways. I'm in full agreement with that. The problem is that so far in the political and in the academic discourses, the costs of transition are considered so astronomical, so unheard of, so undeterminable, that nobody has come up with plausible scenarios of how one could move from here to there. And since you cannot beat something with nothing, as long as there do not exist any type of analysis and constructive proposals on how this transition could be managed without catastrophic consequences, we do not get out of a situation in which the political discourse, not only in Italy but also in France and in practically all other member states, says we do not consider that option in any way in our considerations. There are individual politicians suggesting that Greece ought to go out, but that's immediately squelched by a broad consensus that says you cannot say that, it cannot be part of the political debate. And I would agree that allowing Greece to go out or Portugal to go out would have much worse implications than if we had a common, organized, orderly, planned transition from the monetary union to a more flexible system that reestablishes some degree of member state economic autonomy. And of course it would have to include a massive system of dealing jointly with the costs of having made the mistake in the past, calling it a European Marshall Plan or what you have. It has to acknowledge that it was a common mistake to create the monetary union, and that it's a common obligation to bear the costs of getting out of it again. Throwing Greece out cannot be the answer.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to open up at this point the discussion. I see Davide in the back.